Why else do I want this? Well, I'm now pushing back beyond the data all the way up to the original experiment. And this is where I make a confession. And my confession is that mine, along with most other laboratories I know, do not actually manage our digital output very well at all. In fact, it's a disaster. We use project management tools, things like Basecamp and so forth, but there's still a lot to be desired. So it turns out the intellectual memory of my laboratory is mainly in my email folders. So I have an email folder for projects, for people, and so on, and there's too much of a hub and spoke. There's not the kind of knowledge-sharing kind of environment you would look. So I call this is an unhealthy, this is the truth. And I want to get past this, and I want to get past this so it becomes organized and it becomes the beginning of what was the publishing process. So just to sort of embarrass myself even further, this is also the truth of mine and many other labs. All right? I generate way more negative data. Negative data is important. I mean, there's no way it's ever going to be published in a form, but it's very important to people doing experiments. That right now is lost. There is no association of that negative data for the most part, with ultimately the published paper. That needs to change. My content management is a mess. So how I have slides and posters and lab notebooks, none of that is in any really, we use electronic notebooks and so forth, but a lot of this information is just lost. If you believe this podcasting notion that I just described to you, where it's a matter of turning on a smartphone and actually making a podcast, well, we could be recording journal clubs right now. And those journal clubs, as just an example, we have journal clubs and there's slides associated with them and the paper, but all of that basically gets lost, and it's certainly not available to other people. I would actually really like to hear and listen, maybe not to all of it, but if you've got this synchronized podcast, I could flip through the slides of someone else's lab doing a journal club on a paper, maybe even one of my papers, but a paper from a note that I'm interested in, and I can flip through the slides and see the discussion they had, and then I say, oh, that part sounds interesting. I click on that, and basically the podcast starts by the journal club discussion at that point. A good point to actually have all that data together would actually be what now is called the publication itself. So it would actually, in my view, enrich the so-called research article if these other components were readily accessible from it. I mean, there's a lot of debate about this, obviously. Another part of that is, of course, of all the methods, and I'll get to why all this is important a bit more in a second. But, we basically, all of the software we develop is open source. But, where is it? When the graduate student leaves the lab, everything disappears. Everything sort of goes to pot, basically. And in fact, we and other people have looked at this. Some of you probably know there's a thing called the Nucleic Acids Research Database issue and the server issue in the life sciences, where each year it's a sort of catalogue of these resources. Well, if you go back and look at those resources, which are really about published, they're published papers about data and so forth, and web servers, in 1 year, pretty much 10% of those are gone. They're just not there anymore. If they are, you can't find them. Some of them have new URLs and you can hunt around and get to them. And then basically 10% a year disappear after that. So the persistence of this stuff right now is very poor. And as scientists, we really ought to be doing a better job. I think, and there's no question, if you then sort of map that into why I want this, it comes down in part to reproducibility. I'd say reproducibility is sort of one of these dirty things in science that we put under the rug. We believe when we publish papers that the experiments are reproducible. When we go and read other people's papers, they're rarely reproducible without actually going back to the original authors, at least at some level, and getting the data, which of course is not necessarily, most often not there. So this is sort of one of the motivations for me in actually wanting this kind of change. The other, of course, is the preservation of the digital record, which I already alluded to. Right now, journals do a wonderful job of preserving the knowledge about that data, but don't really have anything to do, for the most part, with the data itself. This was brought up this morning, but we're in this era of the changing role of the library and the notion of emerging institutional repositories, some more developed than others. but I think there's a huge role to play in this process here. So it becomes a partnership between the scientist, the library, and the publisher in a way that we just don't have today. And then the other part of it is that management of data in general. You know, there are, it's true in this country as well, but also in the US, there are programs from the NIH, NSF, and so forth that support data. They actually have data policies now. The NSF just came out with a new data policy, all requiring data to be deposited and so forth. The problem is that most of the money so far has gone into a very small number of very large data sets. In actual fact, the reality of it is a huge long tail. So there's a very large number of small data sets that just basically get lost, and actually most of those then prevent any kind of reproducibility of the experiment after a year or two, I would argue. So I'd say we're doing a pretty poor job there, and that's what I call the long tail.